I want to first, of course, tell you how I appreciate being here. I am, as said, spending a semester, a foreign word here, at NICO. I am on sabbatical from Purdue, which is, I see, is just down the road here in West Lafayette, Indiana. And so I hope to actually be able to get back and forth even when I'm not on sabbatical, but I have this window of time that allows me to do things that I otherwise can't do. And unfortunately, that window of time is slipping away very rapidly, and I haven't do very many of those things. But one of the things that I want to do is do this kind of thing, is visit with you. So I really appreciate having that opportunity to do that. And one of the things that I wanted to do in this time is to revisit my long-standing book project, which is something I probably started too much time ago to even remember, but I've never quite been able to get it do it in the way that I'm satisfied with, and I've always been distracted by lots and lots of smaller projects that are more manageable and easier to complete. But a sabbatical seems like a right time to consider such a thing, and what I've done is I've sort of come up with what I think is a slightly different idea about how to frame it in terms of ideal types of network theory. The book has always been intended to be theory, but I just have decided that maybe this is the right way to actually put it all together in a way that will at least satisfy me and allow me to get it done. I'm not satisfied, it'll never get done. So in any case, I'm delighted to be able to try to present this whole strategy to you, and I haven't really put it together in a formal way before. I feel like I've been using this strategy in my work since the beginning, just more implicitly than explicitly. So I'm trying to actually explicate what is the strategy that I've been using and what is a strategy that might work. And so that's what I want to do today. And I especially appreciate having an audience like this who's, a networks kind of audience who knows about some of this kind of stuff and can give me comments, criticisms, suggestions, and all that good stuff. And so I'm looking forward to that. So thank you. So here goes. All right, social network theorizing using ideal types. And so let me just make, whoops, wrong one. All right, let me make a general statement about network analysis that I don't think is going to be too controversial in this context, but maybe in others. Network analysis usually means data reduction, data description, visualization, and then maybe telling a cool story about the pictures. And that's sort of the routine for most network analysis in most places at most times, including at the Sunbelt meetings and other things like that. Now, I don't want to be too critical of that because I do understand that lots of good people make a good living doing just that, and many of you may wind up eating and getting by very well and allowing you to do the things that you really want to do by actually doing that for people who find it an important and valuable thing to do. So I don't want to put it down in any way, shape, or form, but network analysis is really theory-driven. That's either theory constructing or even theory testing. And social scientists, other scientists, like to think that we are developing some kind of sort of body of theory. And so we really need to go beyond the descriptive kind of stuff more than we do. Now, I'm not saying we don't do it, but we don't do it as much as we. So what is theory? Okay, that's always the question. Theory, basically, ironically, theory is rarely well defined. No, I guess in a theory class, somebody will tell you what it is, but somebody else will tell you something different, so it doesn't matter that much. Okay, what we all know is that theory is good. Okay, and the absence of theory is bad. And there's not much worse than being called atheoretical. That's a bad thing. And you get it in reviews and papers, and you get it in talks and things like that. And lots of stuff is passed off as theory, including just the fact that somebody somewhere just said something would be true, and that's now a theory, okay? Or somebody found something, and that's now a theory, okay? Basically, what I'm going to say is, I'm going to take the risky position that everything that somebody says or found is not considered theory. Okay, I'm going to take that really strong position and say that's not theory, no matter what anybody says. Theory should be some sort, what I would say is theory should be some sort of set of principles such that under some set of identifiable conditions, one can generally make some useful predictions, I'm supposed to say, for a relatively simple set of assumptions. Okay. Now, there is not, and there should not be, as far as I'm concerned, any general theory for all purposes, all times, all places. Under certain conditions, you should be able to identify those conditions and be able to make predictions under those conditions. So theory is contingent. That it's useful to the extent that it produces useful predictions over a relatively wide or important set of real conditions. Okay, you want the theory to be applicable somewhere that matters. Real conditions. Okay, what are real conditions? And I just want to say, conditions that exist in nature are real conditions, but also conditions that can be made to exist in nature. So if we can construct a network of a certain type, then that's fair game also for these kinds. So what we want to do is develop theory that can make useful predictions under conditions that we find and care about, or under conditions that we might want to deliberately create. That's the general goal. Okay, so what's the nature of theory? Now here I'm not going to take any risks. Theory can be lots and lots of very different kinds of things, okay? And I'm not going to pretend to tell you what theory is in any essential way or what it should be in general. Anything that allows you the broad ability to make predictions over a variety of several different types of important conditions is theory for me. And in fact, I wanted to mention that Steve Borgatti has been engaging in a social network theory project funded, as I understand it, by the Defense Department, where he's been going around asking social network analysts what they mean by theory and getting many different answers to the question. And I was delighted that one of his graduate students interviewed me, and I got a chance to tell him my view of this. And hopefully, he's going to put all this together in some great book where you can read my view and maybe Nash's view and other views, and people can pick and choose their favorite version of theory from the menu that's provided in that book. I hope he actually does it. Okay. And what I'm here today is to tell you about one way to do this. Not the only way, not the right way, anything like that, but just one way that I think is a good way to do this. And that's an approach to theory using ideal types, which some of you may recognize. Sociology, I mean, is associated with Max Weber, had this idea of ideal types that it's at least often presented in theory courses. I'm not sure if it's presented much else or people really do it much. But it has a classical constitution, and I think my approach is pretty similar in spirit, at least. An ideal type of social network is one that can be determined to have several specified defining characteristics. You know one when you see one. An ideal type is useful to the extent that it exists, okay, or at least if that set of conditions exists. An ideal type is just a name for the set of conditions. Or it can be made to exist, and if it has important implications. And when I say important implications, for what? So I just want to specify that. The implications can be for the behavior of the network as a whole. The implications can be for the experience or behavior of individual nodes within the network. Or it could be implications for other entities within the system. There are lots of possible implications for different levels of analysis. So there are implications for ties, for groups, for conditions, sections. There can be implications for lots of things. But there need to be some implications for it to be of any value at all. Okay. So an ideal type should be distinct. I mean, it's possible for several different sets of defining characteristics to occur together so commonly that one really can't distinguish one from another. Okay, and then this is kind of a problem. I say it's this, but somebody else says it's that. And since those things are so similar, nobody can tell them apart anyway. In that case, one should probably define them all as a single ideal type. If you can't tell the difference anyway, they're always together, just call it one thing and don't bother distinguishing these things. So, I mean, that happens sometimes. If you can't distinguish them, don't fuss about it is basically what I would suggest. But analysts often do argue about seemingly meaningless distinctions sometimes, and at least my view, my favorite example is arguments about whether a particular distribution of degree in a network is scale-free, power-law, and zip, odd, normal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. People argue about this all the time, but they're all heavy-tail distributions, but I think they almost always have similar implications. That's not to say they can't have different implications, And for a particular purpose, they may have different implications. So it may be worth fussing about when you can tell the difference and when it means something different. But if you can't figure out what difference it makes, don't fuss about it. I mean, basically, all right. So when to distinguish among similar ideal types, it may be useful to distinguish an ideal type from other seemingly similar ideal types, if and only if it's practical to distinguish them. They don't always occur together. So that at least some of the time they've got to occur different. One has to be there more than another, or one has to be there and not the other. And more importantly, the distinction actually makes a difference, that they have different types of implications, okay, that it matters whether it's one or another, so that you want to distinguish these two different ideal types. If they look similar, if one of them has certain implications and the other doesn't, okay. So that's when it makes a difference and when you should care about it. Worry about the difference only when it matters. So you need to, when you're proposing an ideal type, I think you need to demonstrate that it matters, that it's different from others, and that it has implications that are different from others that otherwise look similar in many respects. So I want to illustrate the value of ideal type theorizing today. And before I do that, I want to sort of mention that there are different types of networks for which one would want to develop different ideal types. Right? So you can have undirected or symmetric networks, okay? And there may be a certain number of ideal types for networks of that sort. Have transitive network like that would have separate clusters, or you could have sort of a network of islands and connected bridges, or lots of different ideal types that you might have in a situation like that. Or in directed networks, where ties have arrowheads on them, okay, where the direction matters, is a different situation. You want a different set of ideal types for networks like that. You might also have multiplex networks with multiple different kinds of ties, and you might want to develop ideal types for certain types of multiplex networks. You might have valued networks. You might have different types for valued networks. So basically, there's not like one all-purpose set of ideal types. It depends on what you're talking about. You might have different sets of ideal types for different purposes. And even egocentric networks, which is a whole different animal altogether, you might have ideal types of those also. But I'm going to talk specifically about ideal types of directed networks. All right. So consider some ideal types for directed networks. Researchers have recognized various types of hierarchies. Basically, when you have directed networks, people are usually concerned about ordering in the system. So hierarchies is usually what people are looking for in one form or other. Sensitivity is one which is familiar, where A chooses B, or if there's a tie from A to B and B to C, then there's a tie from A to C. Okay, that's the basic notion of transitivity in a directed network. Another common notion of a hierarchy is a core periphery network, which has a long history, but it really has kind of a codified history dating not that long back to Borgatti and Effort's papers, maybe it's 15 years ago now, but that's like terribly long in the grand scheme of things. Where basically nodes differ in value in some sense, such that ties are disproportionately from and to higher valued nodes. Some nodes get or give lots of ties, and others give few ties. And that's basically a core periphery network, although they defined it, as I'll mention later, entirely for symmetric networks. They didn't actually really define it for directed networks. You have to modify their definition a little bit in order to get a hierarchy for directed networks. And then the third one I want to talk about is our own, I call a robust network hierarchy. Out degree is much more heavily concentrated than in degree. If I say concentrated, I mean much more variable. I mean, some have a lot and others have a little. Okay? And where ties have a correlation of out degree. I'm going to have to explain that. That was too abstract and out of context. So I'll spend more time talking about the one that I really want to tell you about anyway. I'll explain it to you. All right. So taking them in reverse order and starting with the one I really want to talk about. The pattern of the network of placements basically is a prototype. I mean, this ideal type arose, and I think many arise similarly with an observation of a real network. Okay, you find a real network and a sort of pattern. You say, aha, there's something about that pattern that suggests that you may find it again and again, and it might be important to recognize it when you see it. So this particular pattern was recognized by looking at the network of placements among PhD granting sociology departments. And it's been described in some respects by, in published material, by Hanneman and Connections and by Val Burris in the American Sociological Review, both of which did that before I got a chance to publish anything about it, but I was discovering it about the same time. And so basically, a number of people have noticed this pattern out there, that there's this very distinct pattern in the network of placements, okay? And Bernie Goffman and I have used this network as the prototype for the ideal type that we have come to call a robust network hierarchy, which I think is a good name for this particular type of pattern. I hope I can convince you that it's a good name. All right. So what are the characteristics of the sociology placement network that makes it worthy of being called an ideal type? All right. There are roughly, so I'm just going to describe in round number terms rather than try to do any systematic analysis, but to give you a feel for what this is, there are roughly 100 American PhD granting sociology departments. And they have an average of about 20 faculty members each, not varying terribly much, although there are some bigger than others, who receive their PhDs from others of these departments. I mean, people go from one department to another. They get trained in one, they're employed in another. And so a tie between two departments, we're talking about a network among departments, is a faculty member that got their degree in one and is employed by another. Okay. The out degree is concentrated such that 5 of those departments in particular account for 30% of the faculty, right? Now that's a lot of concentration in a few places, all right? And it shouldn't surprise you, although it wouldn't necessarily be true, and it's not automatically true, but it shouldn't surprise you that department prestige is very well indicated by its out degree. So basically there are, I said 5 departments account for 30% of the faculty. Those 5 departments, just to give you, you can check it against your own intuitions, are Wisconsin, Chicago, Berkeley, Michigan, and Harvard. So they're not entirely surprising set of departments. They are that you'd probably expect, or at least among the ones you'd probably expect to be the top 5 and so. And in particular, on the 2000, Wisconsin accounts for about 140 of them, okay, all by itself, okay. There are lots of departments that don't account for any of them because even though they produce PhDs, they won't. So that's basically the nature of it. There's a heavy concentration, and there's a positive correlation of out degrees such that more prestigious departments tend to hire faculty from more prestigious departments. So even though students from Harvard get hired throughout the system, they especially get hired at the top, okay? And the same thing is true for Chicago with those top schools. They get hired even throughout the system. There are people in some of the lowest ranking schools in sociology. But there are more of them at the high ranking schools. Okay? And actually when I talk specifically about this pattern to the sociology department here, what's in some length to describe the Northwestern sociology department, which just incidentally has 6 faculty members from Chicago, 4 from Berkeley, 4 from Harvard, and from Michigan, and 1 from the other. Meaning 18 of the faculty of the 25 come from these 5 schools. So, that's, maybe 30% of all the faculty, but it's a good 72% of the faculty at Northwestern, okay, which is actually a relatively prestigious school, just for your information. If we rank schools according to their placements in other departments, Northwestern's about 14 or 15 out of 100. Just to make this of some local particular interest. Okay, we define a directed network to be a robust network hierarchy if it has the following properties. A high concentration of out degree relative to in degree among those. So in this case, at all the departments have about 20 faculty members, which is in degree. But they vary widely in their out degree, which is the number of faculty we have trained, okay, that are in the system. Okay. And a positive correlation of out degree. Out degree is an indicator of prestige, so that prestigious students go to prestigious departments, basically. And I also added in there something which I think is important, although it's a little harder to quantify, although all of it's a little harder to quantify, is that the pattern is self-similar and that these properties are characteristic of parts of the system as well as the system as a whole. So I take that to mean that if we actually drop the top 5 departments and just look at placements among the rest, you get a very similar pattern. So if you drop any of them arbitrarily, I mean, you don't have to take a random sample, just drop a bunch of them, the pattern would look the same. I mean, is what it turns out at all parts of the system. And I think that that's pretty interesting. So, and that's really the basis of calling it a robust network hierarchy, because it exists no matter how you look at it, it comes out more or less the same. So that's why we named it that. And this pattern has been found in several different contexts. In particular, it's been effectively replicated at different time periods of sociology. So Burris and Hanneman did, I didn't just find it once. They did it in several different time periods. And they and others have also done it in other disciplines, including political science, physics, history, and actually comm. I don't know how many of you are actually in comm, but maybe you are. George Barnett has done some of these kinds of things in comm and published some of them. I'm actually a little surprised that it would be true in comm, because I think of comm as being well called together, and that could kind of foul up the unity of the whole system. But I'm not expert on that. You would know better than I. But apparently, George has found that the pattern is there. Okay, so what are the important implications of a robust network hierarchy? I mean, I say, all right, we found one, but what difference does it make? What difference does it make that it has these patterns? And the one that we actually, which I think is potentially very important, is the potential for what we call leveraged majority dominance. It's illustrated in this particular network of sociology department placement. In the sociology network, 10 departments, I said 5 supply 30% of the faculty. Actually, 10 supply about 40% of the faculty. But those 10 that supply 40% of the faculty supply more than 50% of the faculty for 37 top departments. So although they supply 40% overall, they especially supply them to the top departments, and they supply a majority of the faculty for 37 of the top departments. Okay, may or may not be exactly the top 37, but they're among the top 37. And those 37 supply a majority for 75 departments. So basically, that supply a majority for everybody. So basically, if it means something, and we claim that it does, that if the 10 departments, these 10 departments supply a majority for say, 37 for the next level, that they may actually dominate and have kind of dominant influence on those 37. And then those, now would be a little public, if you're allowed to exaggerate it, then transmit that, because they determine the majority of 75, which then determine the majority of everybody. There's at least possibility of what we call leveraged majority dominance by the top departments, indirectly by dominating the next level, which dominates the next level. And it's not a very long chain. It's got only a couple of links. Furthermore, the top 10 departments supply at least 60% of the faculty to one another. So the idea that they might actually have a unified front in influencing the others is at least somewhat plausible, because they're all feeding one another even more than they're feeding everybody else. So the faculty at those top 5 departments, almost all come from those top 5 departments, okay? And so that it wouldn't be surprising that they have developed some kind of common culture, that they agree on something. If you're in the system, you probably pay more attention to the things you disagree about, which is pretty typical, but from the outside, if you're looking a little bit more objectively, you'd expect that there would be a common culture that would develop of all of these people are just trading places, moving from one to the other, and there might be common culture for those top departments, which then makes it plausible that they might then transmit it, because if they didn't have a common culture, then it wouldn't matter that they dominated somebody else to dominate somebody else, because there's nothing that they would use at dominance. So at least plausible that they would. Now, it would be nice to show that there are actually empirical consequences of that. And it's a challenge to show that the potential for leveraged majority dominance is actually realized with regard to content that matters. In fact, part of the reason I hadn't published a lot of this stuff was about 10 years ago when I first submitted it, some stubborn AJS reviewer said, that's neat, but show me it matters, okay? I don't believe any, I mean, it's just, as far as they were concerned, mathematical games, if you can't show me that it actually has empirical consequences. I thought, and I still think that was unfair. Lots of people pump stuff like that. That's obviously important to miss out. This seems to be to me. But they insisted that I produce empirical evidence, and that's been a challenge since then. So, I mean, I keep learning more and more about the abstract structure, but I still don't have the clinching empirical demonstration that the world actually works according to this pattern and it makes a difference. Okay. So one of the things I've been doing here is I raised this issue when I talked at Sociology here at Northwestern and asked for some suggestions, and I got some. And I also talked to some of my NICO colleagues and talked about some possible ways of actually finding empirical indicators of certain kinds of cultural characteristics of departments that are then transmitted to other departments in the pattern that I would predict if the system works as anticipated. But if you have any other ideas, they're most welcome, okay? I mean, the problem is not entirely solved in terms of demonstrating the empirical consequences. So that's a little bit of an aside, but it's useful to me. Nevertheless, I believe that this potential is strong enough, and I'm confident that it will find important consequences either in this network or in other robust network hierarchies. And I think that basically, it's worth further investigation even before or without having the empirical evidence that the emphasis on culture has diffused from Princeton through Northwestern to the peons or elsewhere, or other kinds of actually concrete demonstrations. I think it's so plausible that I think in one way or another it's going to be right and it's worth it. But I admit that I haven't done it. Second implication, which I think is interesting, is that mentors are from the top 10. And this one I'm going to write a paper on, and maybe AJS will like this one, okay? Even without my demonstrating it makes any difference, because sometimes they buy things like, all your friends have more friends than you, that I don't have to demonstrate that makes any difference. Because everybody knows it makes a difference, okay? So every once in a while you can do something like that, and people will buy it without some fancy statistical analysis of some arbitrary data that will demonstrate the point. In any case, the fact that faculty nearly universally move down the prestige hierarchy, which is inevitable because top departments only hire a few and they produce a lot, so therefore their students have to go down, and their students have to go down, and their students have to go down. So basically what you find, among other things, is that, basically faculty in these systems always have their degrees at one place that is higher prestige than at the place where they actually wind up in course. I said always, I shouldn't say 80% of them, in fact, is what the number is like for real, okay? We're trained at a higher prestige place than at the place where they wind up working. So what that means is that faculty have mentors in higher prestige places than the places that they work. Also means that those mentors have mentors at even higher places than they work, okay? And so what that means is that a large majority of all faculty have mentors who are in the top 10 departments. I told you the top 10 departments supplies 40% of the faculty, so they supply 40% of the mentors. But they supply considerably more than 40% of the mentors' okay? So a very high proportion of the faculty can trace their genealogies, if you will, their academic genealogies to the few top 10 departments because of this structure. Okay, I mean, because of these two properties that are in this. And so, this paper is going to be entitled "Why Your Mentors Come from the Top 10." Okay, and so I hope that will reach. But that's another inevitable property of a robust network hierarchy, Okay. So the two logical implications that I'm pointing out, and there may be more, but the idea is just to find something that matters in order to justify why identify a robust network hierarchy, is the potential for leveraged majority dominance from the top, and that mentors overwhelmingly come from the top. Specific numbers I've given you may vary some, can be shown that the implications follow logically from the concentration of top degree and the positive correlation of it. So these are inevitable consequences of the characteristics that define the system, and so that basically it's not just coincidental. So, all right, is that different from other types of hierarchies? Okay, I mean, people talk about hierarchies forever. We didn't invent the idea of hierarchies or, at all. Okay, and so I gave you three different types of hierarchies. I said, in addition to the robust network hierarchy, I said transitive network and a core periphery. So now I want to compare this with a core periphery to some extent and see how we do this. A Bourgauldian effort to describe an ideal type core periphery pattern for a non-directed network. They suggested that it can be approximated by supposing that nodes have values and the probability of the tie between nodes is proportional to the product of their values. So basically, if the two high-value nodes have lots of ties, two low-value nodes have little ties, and ties that between a high and low are sort of intermediate. But in a directed network, it's only the out degree that varies by prestige. Because all the departments pretty much, if you think about the example I'm using, all the departments pretty much have the same size. I mean, to exaggerate the point a little bit, but they pretty much have very similar sizes. So it's not like ties in both directions vary by prestige. Only out degrees vary by prestige. So if we modified their notion of core periphery, so only the out degrees vary by prestige, and that the in degree is pretty much constant for all departments, and that produces a generalization or at least a modification of their core periphery to directed. So the problem with directed core periphery network is a core periphery network concentration of out degrees. Because, I mean, the idea is prestigious departments get lots of ties, okay? They get lots of choices, or actually with lots of out degree, okay? I mean, I've got to be careful about which way I talk about this, because I could do this whole thing backwards and it would all be the same, so I've got to just stay in the same direction, okay? Out degree means that a department sends their faculty to somebody else, okay? I mean, I can confuse things by saying that they buy them, but in any case, we'll just try to stay without that basically, the prestigious departments send lots of ties, and very prestigious do account for a very disproportionate number of the faculty. That would be consistent with the notion of a concentration of the ties. But the core periphery network defined in this way does not have any correlation with out degree. Basically, high prestige places send faculty with a high probability everywhere. Okay. More or less everywhere equally, if this is the way it's defined. So there would be no potential. Basically, all departments, if 40% of the faculty come from the top 10, and it was a core periphery, you'd expect 40% of all the departments would come from the top 10. And it wouldn't really vary, at least by this pattern. And therefore, there would be no potential for leveraged majority dominance, because the top 10 would only account for 40% of all the departments. It wouldn't really account for a majority of any department. Now, it's true that if we then went to 20, maybe 20 departments would account for more than 50% of all the departments. Okay, well, that's kind of, but they would only account for about the majority of one another also. So they wouldn't necessarily have much in common. And it just doesn't work the way that the leveraged majority dominance does, where there's cohesion among the top, and then there's systematic even majority dominance going down. So this kind of core periphery has one of the two properties it's defining. It has concentration of out degree, but it doesn't have the correlation of in degree, and it therefore doesn't have the property of leveraged majority dominance, and it doesn't have the property even of the mentors. Mentors are going to be high in the same proportion as mentors are high. So it doesn't work. All right, what about the other type, a directed transitive tree? All right, well, a fully connected, I mean, there are different ways of operationalizing these things. So I'm basically giving you a way to do it. And, I mean, there might be other ways of operationalizing a directed core periphery also. I just sort of picked what I think is a plausible one. Directed transitive tree, a fully connected directed transitive tree is a network where each node sends to every node beneath it. And it's fully connected. So basically, they send one way or the other, and basically every node sends down. Okay. All right. What are the properties of this type of directed tree? Such a directed transitive tree does have some concentration of degree, but not as much as we'd expect in a robust network hierarchy. If just to sort of use some concrete numbers, in an ordered 100-node network, the nodes would send, the top one would send 99, the next one would send 98, the next one would send 97. I mean, that would be basically how it works. And there would be a concentration at the top. The top would send a lot more than the bottom would send nothing. But the top 10, just adding these numbers up, would provide 945 out of a total of 49, which is only 19%. So basically, if it's spread out in this particular way, it's not that highly concentrated. Concentrated at the top, but not, that basically the top 10 provide 19%. In the sociology network, I talked about they could 40%. I mean, it's a big difference in the extent of the concentration. Now, again, you might be able to come up with a transitive tree that has other kinds of concentration. Not the most obvious one in any case. Now, there would be a positive correlation of out degree in a transitive tree because the ones near the bottom only send to the bottom. Okay, the ones near the top send everywhere, and so the average destination is higher for the top than it is for the bottom, and there would be a correlation of out degree in this. So it does actually meet that property. But the potential for leverage dominance would be more indirect. There wouldn't be, there is some potential for leverage dominance, but because there's not a high concentration at the top, it doesn't really work very well. So the top 10 would supply a majority for the top 19. Okay. Basically, well, or believe me, which would supply a majority to the top 37, which would supply a majority to the top 73, which would supply a majority to the rest. Okay. So it would be weaker. I mean, it would work, but it would work with more steps and to a lesser extent. And so it's really not nearly as powerful. Similarly, mentors would be higher up than the mentors, but not much higher. So maybe 30% would be in the top 10 compared to 19% of the mentors. So it does have sort of some of this property because there is concentration and there is correlation of out degree. So it is sort of a weak version of it, but it is a weak version of it, so it doesn't work very well. So basically what I'm arguing here is it's worthwhile identifying a robust network hierarchy and distinguishing it from these other kinds of hierarchies because it has implications that are different from these other types of hierarchy. And so what we've shown is that a robust network hierarchy has potentially important implications, and all hierarchies are not necessarily robust network hierarchies. Therefore, it seems useful to distinguish which hierarchies are and which hierarchies aren't this particular ideal type for predicting these types of implications. So I think that's kind of the first step in actually identifying an ideal type is justifying its existence by showing it actually matters and it makes a difference. Once one has identified a useful ideal type, though, then what next? Okay, that's basically, then what? All right? Okay, we've got an ideal type, then we need to sort of study it, okay, and learn more about it because they're out there, they have implications, we want to know more about them. So once one is convinced an ideal type is important, then it becomes useful to consider the circumstances that create such an ideal type. I mean, where are they? Why are they? How did they get to be that way? And so there may always be multiple possible causes. I mean, you find a pattern. I mean, sometimes people suggest, it must have formed this way. Actually, one of my objections to lots of models is people find a way to produce it. They say, that's what did it. Well, maybe they could have, but there might have been others, agent-based models that would also produce the pattern. So just coming up with a story is not necessarily convincing. You need to come up with a story that is also plausible and realistic in the circumstances that might generate such a pattern. And even that is not overwhelming, deterministic, but at least you've got to not just find anything that would do it, but something that's actually plausible in the circumstances. So going back to our prototype, that sociology placement network, we can try to figure out why does it take the form that it does, okay? And so we suggest that there are exogenous bases for large differences in prestige. There are reasons why departments have different prestige. I don't actually think they emerge from the system. Some network analysts think everything comes from networks. I don't believe that, okay? I mean, I think networks reflect differences that are there before the networks, okay? And I think that that's more often what's going on here. There are big differences in generalized institutional prestige of universities. Actually, those Ivy League universities predated sociology, okay? And they were prestigious back when, okay? and they still are. Not surprisingly, at least one of those Ivy League universities came up in that list. There are big differences in resources for hiring faculty. There are rich schools and poor schools. Some have lots more resources for hiring faculty and for recruiting good graduate students. There are big differences in investments, specifically in sociology. The University of Chicago, was invested in sociology a long time ago. I mean, while lots of other schools didn't. And so that the investments in sociology may be different. The University of Arizona is a whole lot more sociology than it is in everything else, presumably because some dean or higher up decided to invest specifically in sociology. So there are differences in those kinds of things. And there are big differences in the prestige of the particular faculty that are there for any given reason, sometimes by accident, sometimes for these other reasons. But that is self-reproducing. I mean, once you've got a very prestigious faculty, then other people want to go there, and they can get more good faculty and more good graduate students. So basically, there are all kinds of things that make certain departments prestigious and attractive. Once the pattern exists, then the faculty and the system carry forth their impressions of that. So that, once prestige exists and once people have the idea that that's a prestigious department, that good people go there, people give resources to it, all these kinds of things that are sort of self-reproducing. And especially if you're a student from one of these prestigious places, you're sure that they're the best places. These things maintain themselves over time once they exist. Now, those differences in prestige produce differences in demand for graduates. All departments want to hire the best faculty, which often are presumed to come from the most prestigious departments. So everybody tries to hire the students from these good places because they figure they're the best people to hire. Okay. Clearly, what faculty might come from those few top departments if there were enough of them to supply them. I mean, everybody would hire, forget about everybody else, we'll just hire the top. And so it's not surprising that there's a high concentration of the faculty that come from a few places. It may even be surprising that they don't all come from there because they just don't produce enough students or enough good students to actually supply every place. So it's not surprising there's a concentration, and it's very simple that once there is a prestige like this, and once they supply enough that people can choose, then what they do is they disproportionately choose the top places. That's what's going on. Now, demand for the most prestigious students exceeds supply. Therefore, many of those most prestigious students have options about which jobs to take, and they choose the more prestigious jobs. Okay, that's basically what happens. So that produces a positive correlation with altitude. I mean, basically, those students, get highly recruited, and they get to decide whether they want to go to Chicago or to Purdue or the range from the top to the middle to the bottom, at least as these numbers. Okay. Essential conditions. So there needs to be, what I'm suggesting here is there needs to be shared beliefs in the different values of the different nodes. Some underlying basis of prestige to begin with is at least one of the things that produces this. From the perspective of the nodes, they value ties from the high-valued nodes. Everybody tries to get ties to the high-valued nodes. From the perspective of the ties, they value being tied to the high-valued nodes. So in some sense, one way of looking at this is there must be enough potential supply of possible ties from the high-valued nodes to provide more ties, but not so much that they can supply all the ties, okay, in order to have this different. And it requires kind of agency, if you will, from both the nodes who are choosing ties and from the ties who are choosing nodes that they want to go to. Is what it is. All right, so where else might we find these conditions? Well, as I said before, people have already found these in lots of departments, lots of people. So expect all national and international self-reproducing training systems like this one to follow this pattern, as long as there's flexible but limited supply. I mean, that's the condition that they have to be enough students from the top to actually fill it out, and not so many to drive everybody out of the system. Another one which has come up, which is very different, okay, and a little harder to explain, a little tricky, is we expect directed friendship networks to follow this pattern, as long as friendship choices are facilitated but do not require some acceptance. So people tend to choose the prestigious people as their friends, okay, but it's also true that if those people will snub them too embarrassingly, they probably won't, okay? So that, the combination means that there is a disproportionate concentration of, not degree and in degree much, but basically a popularity of those prestigious people And there's also some correlation of people do tend to choose the popular ones a lot, but they also tend to choose more or less at their own level. The high ones especially choose the popular ones. The low ones choose lower than that. So both of these happen, and you get a pattern which actually should be very similar to this kind of thing. And there may be others, but those are just the kinds of circumstances that we've identified already. All right. Now, I'm not specified. These things get more complicated. I mean, basically what I'm showing you is this is how it works. I've rounded off the numbers. I've said some things in vague terms that I've gotten away with because nobody's had a chance to say anything yet. Okay. So I've specified how much. I haven't specified how much concentration of out degree is necessary for it to bump us over hierarchy, or even how we measure the amount of concentration. Okay? I've just said it's there. Okay. And I've not specified how much positive correlation of out degree is necessary, or how to measure it, or whether there can be too much, correlation. If they only go to the top, then maybe it's not going to work. So there are issues that need to be resolved, lots more that needs to be specified. I'm not claiming to solve this problem. In terms of causes of the pattern, I've only barely considered the agencies, the modes, and the ties. So I'm just sort of giving you suggestions about the nature of these things rather than having solved all these problems. I'm not pretending to have solved all these problems. All right. But the purpose of this talk is to demonstrate the nature of and the value of social network theorizing using ideal types. And so by showing that the value of one particular ideal type, what I'm trying to do, that ideal type theorizing still has a long way to go. I mean, I haven't developed this ideal type completely. I haven't specified it as nicely as I might like. I haven't done all these things to the full extent of it. But I hope that I've adequately motivated the task to see why you'd want to do it. Okay, which is really what my talk is about today, is why this approach to social network theory is a valuable thing to do, with this just as an illustration. So basically, I'm going to stop there and basically allow you to comment, ask, suggest, both about the strategy of ideal type theorizing, which is principle what I'm talking about, but inevitably you may have something to say about the particular ideal type and the particular theory that I'm suggesting as well. So both of that will be fair game. So. Just be careful in your interpretations. I mean, it may not have. I mean, just because Wisconsin supplies all those faculty doesn't mean it's good to go to Wisconsin. I mean, they get a lot more students than they place also, so be careful. Well, what is it? The network of sociology departments is just that, the network of sociology departments. So when you're talking about these clerkships, what are the nodes? What are the units? Are they schools? I mean, it sounds like it's got to be an extension because there are a number of different levels and units here involved. But one of the things about this example is that there sounds like if schools were the units, there's also ideology that's sort of tying certain ones together. They're not just a broad, diffuse prestige structure. Now, something like that could be true in, say, in sociology or other networks. I mean, it could be that there are qualitative schools in sociology that send to one another, and quantitative schools that send to one another, and that they have independent prestige hierarchies that may even not be all that highly correlated. And so, and even in your group, there might be a liberal hierarchy and a conservative hierarchy, and they're just entirely different. I didn't find that in sociology. I kind of looked for it, and also there could be geographical differences, in sociology or some of these kinds of people stay in their own regions. But at least in the analyses that I've done, I don't find that, at least with the technology network. It seems pretty diffuse. So basically, in general, Berkeley, Chicago, Harvard, and everywhere. Okay, now it's true if you look really carefully, especially if you look lower down, it turns out that all the lower down schools in California get everybody from Berkeley and UCLA. I mean, so it's, it depending on exactly what you're looking at, sometimes there are special shoots of these hierarchies that different. So, and it sounds like maybe that's more relevant for your. I'm starting out. I guess I think that the way to proceed, I mean, at least my theorizing strategy, start with the simple and then incrementally make it more complicated rather than diving into things with too many parts at the beginning. That would be a good way to move up from there. Some of it is self-consciously that way, so they don't even pretend. Yeah, I think that's great. I think I thought some of those ideas, but part of it, a lot of the stuff I've never made explicit. I mean, I've never actually thought it enough to be able to write it down and say this is a good thing to do. But for instance, Nash knows about some of the Nano Hub is a network on the internet, and I thought about, well, if wanted people put things on there to share with other people, and my ideal type of what it should be is that the network should be that some people put things there that other people pick up, and then they make other things to give to other people, and everything should inform everything, and there should be lots of synergy, and everybody should benefit from everything. Well, it doesn't work that way. I mean, and so if you look at the real network, it doesn't behave that way. So the question becomes, or at least that question to me became, how could you make it that way? Now, I have no idea is the answer to the question, but at least by starting with the ideal type, as you say, and thinking, well, what should it look like if you want it to behave that way? What does it look like? And then at least it poses the question. It doesn't necessarily answer it of how do we get from here to there. So I think it's a great idea. Okay. Now, ideal is not a value term. I mean, it's only ideal in the sense of it's a point of comparison. Okay, so I mean, whether you like it or not, I don't actually have a position on that. In fact, one might well think that this is not such a good thing because, having a few departments potentially dominating everything and potentially stifling all the creative ideas of everybody else may not be such a neat thing to happen. So it's not ideal in any normative sense, at least not for me. I mean, it might be for somebody, but so that I don't mean it to be ideal in that sense. I mean, it's only an ideal type in the sense it's a point, you know how this behaves. So it's a type that we can recognize and compare with. Now, whether it's good or bad, reasonable people can disagree, and it may be good or bad in different respects. It may be good for making sure that there's not too many crazy ideas out there because there's kind of monitors keeping track of that. And it might be a bad idea and stifling creativity. I mean, there might be different ways of evaluating its value, but the idea of ideal type theorizing is kind of neutral on that kind of value. Well, I mean, you touch on a problem that often arises with this analysis because the data are the guide to graduate departments in sociology, which some of you may know, which basically are just lists of the faculty in each of these departments with their PhD granting department listed next to their name. So some of those people came directly, some of these people may have gone 3 other places in between, and they have done all kinds of things, but I'm not paying any attention to that intervening process. I mean, I've got where they started and where they ended, and heard everything about the process that got them from one to the other. And basically, what I'm suggesting is that this influence process goes from where you got your PhD to where you are irrespective of things. And so it may or may, how they got there exactly could be that it was in their first hire, it could be in later hires. I don't actually have anything directly to say about it. I mean, if you're interested in that process specifically, then you've got to look more closely. I think so. I guess what I'm claiming, which may or may not be true, is that these things are driven from the top down, and that when Wisconsin and Harvard and a couple of places start doing things, then other places start demanding it because they do it. Okay. Well, this is the kind of thing that I need to do the empirical work on. Okay. What I think will happen, based on my thinking about this, I don't have any direct evidence of it. I have years of experience, but it's kind of selective and specific. Okay. But the theory would suggest that it will start at the top and it will be picked up and forced by the next level, okay? Not immediately by the bottom, and then they will spread it further down, and it will take a while to get to the bottom. They don't get there, okay? But there'll be a little bit of a lag. What should happen is that the top will pick it up first, and the bottom will pick it up last, and that there should be some period in between. It also ought to depend on exactly if there are differences between Wisconsin, something like, neo-Marxist queer theory may not happen equally in all 5 of the top schools. And so if there is any differentiation among them, I would think that you might see that in terms of where they have especially placed their students. So when Chicago changes, Northwestern changes. Okay, when Michigan changes, Northwestern may not. Okay, because it's just not, in sociology, it's not being wagged in that particular way. So that would be my prediction. And whether it actually happens that way is an empirical issue. Yeah. Yeah. Let me just say that I'm hoping, I'm only here for that, and I'm dreading I actually have to go back to teaching, right? I mean, it's Purdue, but my teaching schedule is going to be Tuesday and Thursday, and I'm enjoying it here sufficiently that I'm hoping to get here at least some Mondays and Fridays. So I'm hoping that if you do want to talk, I encourage you to do that. But it's not that urgent that you catch me in the next few weeks, because I hope to be around again. Thank you all.